This is a true story shared on an Urban Explorers forum in 2021. It all started with a strange signal. Daniel, a radio enthusiast and amateur explorer, had always been fascinated by abandoned places and forgotten transmissions. One evening, while scanning through old shortwave frequencies, he stumbled upon something unusual: a faint, repeating message in an old military encryption format. The voice was distorted, broken by static, but the repetition was unmistakable. "Help me. Trapped. Coordinates." His heart pounded. This was no ordinary interference. The frequency seemed to originate from an abandoned military radio station deep in the forest, a place that had been decommissioned decades ago. There were rumors about it, whispers of secret experiments, ghostly transmissions, and people who went searching but never returned. Daniel knew he had to investigate. By morning, he had gathered a small team of fellow explorers. Mark, a skeptic but skilled in electronics. Olivia, a history buff with knowledge of military installations. And Eric, a photographer with an eye for the eerie. Together, they packed their gear, checked their maps, and set off toward the forgotten station. None of them knew that by nightfall, they would hear the signal again, this time much, much closer. The road leading to the abandoned radio station was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and flanked by towering trees. Daniel drove slowly, the tires of his Jeep crunching against the gravel. The deeper they went into the forest, the worse the signal reception on their phones became. Soon, they were completely cut off. "Classic horror movie setup," Eric joked, adjusting the strap of his camera. "No signal, deep in the woods, chasing a creepy broadcast. What could possibly go wrong?" Mark, who was checking their handheld radio, frowned. "That's weird," he muttered. "The signal's stronger here than it was back in town. It's almost like it's leading us somewhere," Olivia finished, glancing at the dense trees around them. She had read about military radio stations before. Some of them were built for intelligence purposes, while others had more secretive functions. But why would one still be transmitting after all these years? After another mile, they reached the station's perimeter. Rusted, barbed wire fences stood half-collapsed, eaten away by time and nature. A faded, restricted area sign hung loosely from one of the metal posts, swaying in the wind. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. "This is it," Daniel said, shutting off the engine. The radio in his hand crackled, and suddenly, the same distorted voice whispered through the static. "Help me. Trapped. Underground." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The signal was clearer now, too clear. It sounded as if whoever was transmitting was just a few feet away. "Did that sound closer to you guys?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel swallowed hard. The real question wasn't if it sounded closer. The real question was, who was sending it? A heavy silence hung over the group as they stared at the rusted fence and the decaying station beyond it. The building itself was a squat concrete structure, its windows shattered, its metal door barely hanging on its hinges. Decades of abandonment had left it scarred by rust and overgrowth. Daniel took a deep breath and adjusted his backpack. "We go in, document what we find, and get out. Simple." Eric smirked. "Yeah, because that always works out, right?" Ignoring the comment, Daniel led the way, carefully stepping over the fallen fence. The others followed, their boots crunching on the damp ground. As they neared the entrance, the radio in Daniel's hand crackled again. "Underground, trapped, find me." The voice was clearer now, almost as if it were inside the building. "That's impossible," Mark muttered. "Unless someone's in there right now." Olivia shivered. Or something. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Old equipment lay in ruins, wires hung from the ceiling like vines, and faded control panels stood lifeless. A long hallway stretched into the darkness, its walls covered in peeling military warnings. Eric raised his camera and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated something strange, a hatch in the floor, partially hidden under debris. Daniel knelt beside it, brushing away dirt and broken tiles. A faded sign beside the hatch read, "Access to lower levels, authorized personnel only." He looked up at the others. "Lower levels? This place wasn't just a radio station," Olivia whispered. "There's something beneath us." Mark ran a hand over the rusted metal. "If the signal's coming from down there," he hesitated. "Someone, or something, might still be inside." A long pause followed. Then Daniel gripped the handle of the hatch and pulled. With a groaning screech, it opened. A rush of cold, stale air spilled out from the darkness below. Then, from the depths, the radio whispered once more. You found it. A heavy silence settled over the group as they stared into the black void beneath the hatch. A narrow metal ladder led downward, disappearing into the unknown. The air that drifted up carried a strange, stale scent, something between rust, damp concrete, and something else. Something metallic. Daniel gripped his flashlight tightly. All right, we go down, check it out, and if things get weird, we get the hell out. Eric snorted. I'd say things are already weird, but sure, let's pretend this is still normal. Mark went first, testing the rungs of the ladder before carefully descending. The others followed one by one, until finally Daniel was the last to climb down, pulling the hatch closed above them. The sound of it shutting echoed through the space below. Their flashlights flickered to life, cutting through the suffocating darkness. They were in a corridor, narrow, lined with corroded pipes and cables running along the ceiling. The walls were covered in old military warnings and peeling signs in Russian. One caught Olivia's attention. Do not enter without authorization. Severe penalty. Eric took a deep breath. Reassuring. Mark fiddled with his handheld radio, adjusting the frequency. The static was louder down here, but beneath it, the voice was still there, whispering through the interference. Closer. Don't leave me. Daniel's stomach tightened. The voice sounded directed at them. They moved forward cautiously. The corridor stretched ahead, leading to a series of heavy blast doors, some ajar, others rusted shut. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Then Olivia froze. Wait, do you hear that? She whispered. The others stopped. A faint tapping sound echoed through the corridor, slow, deliberate, like fingers against metal. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from somewhere up ahead. Daniel's grip tightened on his flashlight as a sick feeling crept up his spine. Whatever was down here, it wasn't alone. The rhythmic tapping continued, slow and deliberate, echoing down the corridor. It was close enough that they could feel it reverberate through the metal walls, but too far to see its source. Mark swallowed hard. That's not the wind, right? Olivia shot him a sharp look. Do you feel any wind down here? Daniel signaled for them to keep moving, stepping cautiously forward. The corridor split into two paths ahead, one leading deeper into darkness, the other to a half-open metal door marked Storage B12. The tapping was coming from inside the storage room. Eric exhaled. I hate this. I really hate this. Ignoring him, Daniel moved toward the door and pressed his hand against it. The metal was ice cold. He glanced at the others, then pushed it open. The flashlight beams cut into the darkness, revealing a room filled with decaying wooden crates and rusted shelves covered in dust. Old military equipment lay scattered on the floor, gas masks, broken radios, corroded metal containers. But the room was empty. No sign of who or what had been making the noise. Daniel took a step inside when, bang! A deafening slam echoed behind him as the door shut on its own. Olivia screamed. Eric yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from the far end of the room, the tapping started again. Slower this time. Closer. Mark frantically scanned the walls with his flashlight, revealing faded documents pinned to a rusted clipboard. One stood out, its paper yellowed and torn but still legible. He read aloud, his voice trembling. Project Colat. Subject remains contained. Do not respond to signals. Daniel's radio crackled violently. The voice, once distant and broken, now whispered directly into their ears, clear, unmistakable. You shouldn't have come. The tapping stopped. Something shifted in the darkness. Then, from the shadows, they heard breathing. The sound of slow, measured breathing filled the room. It wasn't theirs. It came from the far end of the storage space, where the flashlight beams barely reached. Daniel held his breath, scanning the darkness. Eric was frozen in place, his knuckles white as he gripped his camera. Mark stood stiffly by the rusted clipboard, his eyes darting toward the shadows. Olivia pressed herself against the door, still struggling with the handle. Then, a shuffle. Something moved back there. Not a rat, not falling debris. Something large. Daniel's radio crackled violently. The voice whispered, too late, before dissolving into static. Daniel. Olivia's voice was a strained whisper. Open the damn door. He turned, grabbing the handle, but the metal wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been welded shut. Then, footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming toward them. Eric lifted his camera, his hand shaking. "Screw it," he muttered, and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the room for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, they saw it. A figure, hunched, vaguely human, skin pale, stretched too tight over bone, empty, blackened eyes that seemed to absorb the light. Its mouth was slightly open, as if gasping for breath. It was standing just 10 feet away, watching them. Then the light vanished. Darkness swallowed the room once more. Eric choked out, We need to get out." The creature lurched forward. Olivia screamed. Daniel threw his weight against the door. It gave way. They tumbled into the hallway, Eric dropping his camera as he scrambled out. Mark kicked the door shut just as a thudding impact came from the other side. For a long moment, no one moved. Their ragged breathing filled the corridor. Then Daniel picked up the radio with a trembling hand. Silence. Then you opened the door. A distant metallic clatter echoed down the hallway. Something else was awake now. For a long moment, no one spoke. Their breathing was ragged, their nerves frayed. The heavy metal door they had just escaped from stood ominously still, but the radio's last words echoed in their minds. You opened the door. And now, something else was moving. A distant metallic clatter rang out from the far end of the hallway, followed by a slow, dragging sound. It was faint at first, but it was getting closer. Daniel swallowed hard and switched off his flashlight. The others followed suit, plunging them into near-total darkness. Only the faintest red emergency lights flickered along the corridor. Eric whispered, "What the hell was that thing in there?" Olivia shook her head. "I don't want to know." Mark, gripping his radio like a lifeline, muttered, "We need to leave, right now." Daniel took a slow step forward, gesturing for the others to follow. They moved cautiously, keeping their backs to the wall. The hallway stretched ahead, its doors rusted and broken, leading deeper underground. The only way was forward. But then, they heard it. A wet, gurgling breath from around the next corner. Something was standing just out of sight. Daniel held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. The sound didn't move. It just waited. Then, a sharp click. Eric had accidentally nudged his dropped camera. The device powered on with a tiny beep. The breathing stopped. A long, stretching silence filled the corridor. Then, footsteps, fast, heavy, running toward them. "Go!" Daniel shouted. They sprinted down the hallway as the thudding steps thundered behind them. Eric glanced back just once and saw something lurch around the corner, its pale, emaciated form illuminated by the red lights. It was fast. Too fast. They reached a doorway at the end of the hall, an old stairwell leading further down. "Shit, no, we need to go up," Olivia cried. But the door to the upper level was jammed. The only way was down. Daniel hesitated for only a second before making the call. "Go! Now!" One by one, they descended into the darkness, while the thing behind them let out a deep, inhuman groan. As they reached the bottom, Mark's radio crackled to life. "You're getting closer." And somewhere in the pitch-black depths of the facility, something whispered back. The stairwell was narrow, the air thick and stale. Their footsteps echoed in the confined space as they rushed downward, the flickering emergency lights barely illuminating the way. Above them, something scraped against metal. A low, guttural noise followed. Howd, a sound no human throat should make. Eric's breath was ragged. "We're going the wrong way. We're going deeper." Daniel didn't slow. "We don't have a choice." The staircase ended at a rusted metal door. Daniel grabbed the handle and yanked. It resisted at first, but then the corroded latch gave way, and the door swung open with a painful screech. Beyond it, an expansive underground chamber stretched out before them. It looked like some kind of control room. Walls lined with old equipment, flickering monitor screens coated in dust, abandoned desks with scattered documents. The place had been untouched for decades, yet a low hum still vibrated through the air. Something was still running. Olivia stepped forward cautiously. "What is this place?" Mark swept his flashlight across the room. Faded Russian writing covered the walls. One phrase stood out, painted in large red letters above a row of lifeless monitors. "Oni vsё здесь?" They are still here. Eric exhaled shakily. "That's reassuring." Then Daniel's radio crackled. "You're so close now." The voice was stronger this time, more present. Then another sound, a click, a deep mechanical hiss. The monitors in the room flickered to life. Static first, then grainy footage. One screen showed the stairwell they had just come from. A second showed a darkened hallway, one they hadn't entered yet. A third, Daniel's stomach dropped. A third monitor showed this room. Them. Right now. But there was something else in the footage, something standing in the shadows behind them. Mark turned just as the lights flickered out completely. And in the consuming darkness, they heard it move. The darkness swallowed them whole. A low scraping sound filled the room, like nails dragging against metal. It came from the far end, where the security monitors had flickered just moments ago. Then a breath, slow, measured, right behind them. Daniel clenched his fists. Nobody move. Eric's breathing was fast and uneven. It was right there on the screen. It was watching us. Olivia's voice was barely a whisper. It's still watching. A tap sounded against the concrete floor. Then another. Something was stepping closer. Mark gripped his flashlight, his hands slick with sweat. He didn't want to turn it on. He didn't want to see whatever was standing with them in the dark. But then, a sudden burst of static. The radio crackled violently. The voice, distorted but clearer than before, whispered, "Do you see it?" Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He turned on his flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing. The room was empty. No movement. No figure lurking in the shadows. Just the cold, abandoned facility and the lifeless glow of the monitors. But the others were staring at something behind him. Daniel turned, and his stomach dropped. The security screen still showed them standing in the room, but they weren't alone. A tall, emaciated figure loomed just inches behind Daniel's shoulder in the footage. Its skin was pale gray, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its black, sunken eyes were locked directly onto him. But in reality, there was nothing there. Olivia let out a shaky breath. It's not in our world. Mark swallowed hard. Then why is it still watching us? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because at that moment, the security feed changed. The screen flickered, and a new image appeared. A room, a circular chamber, lined with rusted metal walls. A sealed door with thick bolts and heavy locks. And on that door, painted in smeared red letters, the camera feed zoomed in. And then, the locks began to turn. Somewhere deep below them, they heard the sound of a heavy metal door unlocking. Then the radio crackled one final time. The voice whispered, "You let it out." The room went dead silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. The reality of what had just happened, what they had just witnessed, hung in the air like a thick fog. The voice on the radio had stopped, but the sound of the door unlocking still echoed in their minds. Every word from the feed seemed to have marked the beginning of something terrible. Eric finally broke the silence. "What the hell did we just do?" Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the screen, on the door that was now slowly beginning to open. The rusted metal door creaked as if protesting the intrusion, but the unmistakable sound of bolts sliding back filled the room. It was coming. Mark took a step back, his eyes wide with panic. "We need to leave. Now. Before it's too late." But Olivia shook her head, her gaze fixed on the screen. "We can't. It's already awake." Her words hung heavily in the room. There was no turning back now. They had already opened the door by being here, by finding this place, by following the signal. The thing that had been trapped for decades was stirring, ready to escape whatever confines had held it. The cameras continued to show the door opening, the room beyond dark, but something moved inside. A faint shadow, creeping from the depths of the room, growing larger. Daniel's radio crackled again, the voice now a distorted growl, like something struggling to speak. "You shouldn't have found me." The sound sent a chill through the group. They all knew they had to act fast, but none of them knew how to stop what was happening. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. The emergency lights buzzed to life, casting a dim red glow on everything, but it wasn't enough to see clearly. The scraping sound, slow and deliberate, came from deeper within the facility. The thing was coming. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if it was closing in on them. Daniel gripped the radio tightly, trying to get a signal, but all he got was more static. Then, a noise that froze their blood. A loud crash from somewhere above, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the floor. "It's here!" Eric shouted, his voice trembling with fear. Before anyone could react, the security monitor buzzed again, revealing an image that made their hearts stop. The circular chamber. The door they had seen opening. And inside, standing there in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, distorted, its face a twisted mockery of human form. It was looking directly at the camera. It was coming for them. The figure on the screen was like something from a nightmare. Tall, emaciated, with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was a grotesque mockery of humanity, a wide, toothy grin splitting its hollow cheeks. Its eyes were black, empty voids, and they locked directly onto the camera lens with a cold, unnerving intensity. For a moment, the group was paralyzed, staring at the monitor as the creature slowly stepped forward. Its movements jerky and unnatural. Olivia was the first to snap out of it. "We need to get out. Now." Without another word, Daniel turned and bolted for the stairwell. The others quickly followed, their footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the facility itself was pressing in on them. The sound of dragging footsteps came from behind. Something was following them. Closer now. Faster. The creature wasn't just coming from the camera feed. It was coming for them, and it was gaining ground. "Move! Move!" Daniel shouted, urging the others to pick up the pace. He could hear the thing behind them, its breathing ragged and shallow, growing louder with each passing second. The sound of its footsteps, dragging across the floor, grew nearer, filling the hall with a sense of dread. Eric glanced over his shoulder, his face pale with fear. "It's getting closer! It's right behind us!" The stairwell was just ahead, but the door to it was jammed shut, rusted solid. Daniel slammed his shoulder into it, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me!" he shouted, pushing harder. Mark joined him, trying to wrench the door open with all his strength, but it was futile. The sound of the creature's footsteps grew louder. It was almost there. Olivia, panicking, grabbed the radio from Daniel's hand and twisted the dial frantically. "Please, please work," she muttered under her breath. Just as the footsteps drew too close to ignore, the door suddenly creaked open. Mark yanked it wide, and they all spilled into the stairwell, breathless and terrified. They ran down the stairs as quickly as they could, the darkness swallowing them whole. The creature was still behind them. Its breathing was too close now, so close they could almost feel the cold, clammy air it exhaled. Then, an overwhelming crash. A scream echoed in the stairwell, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps above them. The thing had reached the stairs and was closing in fast. "Keep going," Daniel yelled. They sprinted down the darkened corridor at the bottom of the stairs, hands brushing against cold walls. They couldn't stop. They couldn't look back. They had to get out. As they turned a corner, they saw a faint light in the distance. The exit. But the air was thickening, suffocating, and the walls seemed to be closing in. Daniel grabbed the door handle of the exit, his hand shaking as he twisted it. It was locked. "No! No, no, no!" he screamed, banging on the door with his fists. Behind them, the heavy footsteps grew louder. The creature was close, too close. Mark reached into his bag, pulling out a crowbar. He swung it at the door, forcing the lock open with one final strike. The door flew open, revealing a narrow passage leading to the outside world. They burst through into the cool night air, their lungs burning from the adrenaline. For a moment, they stood outside, panting, their eyes wide with disbelief. The facility loomed behind them, dark, silent. Then, in the distance, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal echoed from deep within the facility. And the voice on the radio whispered, one last time, "You're not free yet." The cold air rushed around them as they sprinted through the underground corridors. The echo of their footsteps bounced off the damp walls, but there was no sound of pursuit. Nothing followed them. No ominous footsteps, no scraping or breathing. Just the distant hum of broken machinery and the unsettling silence that had settled over the facility. When they reached the surface, the harsh light of the outside world was almost blinding after the darkness of the lower levels. They stumbled out into the overgrown courtyard of the abandoned station, gasping for air. The trees around them seemed unchanged, the forest still as silent as it had been when they first arrived. Daniel paused, looking back at the building. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anything was chasing them. The hatch they'd opened earlier, the dark corridors, they all seemed to hold their breath, as if the whole place was waiting. "Is it over?" Eric asked, his voice hoarse. He was staring at the building as if expecting something to lurch from the shadows. Olivia wiped her forehead, sweat mixing with the grime from the descent. "I don't know, but I don't think we're being followed. Whatever that thing was, it's not here anymore." Mark adjusted his backpack and checked his radio. There was no signal, just the faint buzz of static. It's like the whole place is dead now. No more interference, no whispers. Daniel glanced at the others. Maybe we've broken the cycle. Maybe whatever was down there, it's locked away again, or it was waiting for something. But whatever it was, it's not after us. They stood there for a moment, not speaking, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. "Well," Daniel said finally, "I think we've seen enough of this place." Without another word, they turned and began walking back toward the Jeep. The station loomed behind them, its decaying concrete walls a silent reminder of the strange events they had just escaped. The road ahead felt longer, but the weight of fear had lifted, replaced by the kind of unease that only came from surviving something truly unknown. As they left, none of them looked back. The forest swallowed the abandoned radio station once more, its secrets hidden deep beneath the earth. When the group returned to Kiev, they couldn't shake the feeling that the events at the radio station were still haunting them. Their minds were certain. Something was wrong with that place, and those anomalies seemed to pull them back. But they decided to put it out of their heads for the time being, trying to recover. However, it seemed that life wouldn't let them forget. Weeks passed, and one evening, while they were discussing their experiences with other local urban explorers, someone knocked at their apartment door. The face on the other side was unfamiliar. He looked like an ordinary man, middle-aged, tired-looking, with eyes that hid too many questions. He introduced himself as Dmitri and mentioned he had been there, at the radio station, before the group arrived. He knew what had happened, and he knew there was something more. At first, they were cautious. Remembering how they had rushed out of the station, they wondered how this man might be connected to their adventure. He explained that he had spent his life working in radio communications and had explored many abandoned sites. But when he mentioned the radio station, his eyes filled with unease. He said that a few years ago, there had been people working there, people who no one knew. These people weren't just using radio waves for communication. They were trying to connect to something far older and more powerful. This station, it didn't just stop working. It was destroyed from within, Dmitri said, his voice trembling slightly. "I tried to figure out what was happening, but no one would talk about it. I saw people disappear, and they disappeared because something or someone draws them in. It's not just radio waves. It's something far more sinister." The group was shocked. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to think. Dmitri didn't seem like the kind of person who would make up such stories. He wasn't selling them ghost stories or tales of monsters. He was just speaking about what had happened at the radio station, and his words were beginning to sound more and more convincing. The tone with which he spoke filled the room with tension. "I was there before, years ago, before you came to these places," Dmitri continued. "You might not believe me, but if you return, I'll show you something you won't ever forget." The strange pull of the place began to resurface in their minds. Inspired and somewhat disturbed by his story, they decided to meet with Dmitri again to learn more. He suggested they not just return to the radio station, but also visit an abandoned warehouse hidden from the eyes of most explorers. Even fewer knew it existed. But this warehouse wasn't just some empty building full of old equipment. It was tied to the very heart of what had been happening at the radio station, and Dmitri claimed that it was there that they could find the answers to everything. What lay hidden behind this warehouse? Why was Dmitri so sure they needed to see this place? And what would happen if they decided to return to that cursed location? The next day, after some deliberation, Daniel and the group agreed to meet Dmitri once again. They had no idea what to expect, but the constant pull of their past experiences with the radio station, coupled with Dmitri's cryptic warnings, seemed to guide them toward what might be the next chapter of this strange saga. They agreed to meet at a cafe near the city center, a place where they could discuss the situation away from prying eyes. When they arrived, Dmitri was already there, sitting in the corner booth, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "You've thought about it, I can see," Dmitri said without preamble as they sat down. "And I'll be straight with you. There's no easy way to explain this. What you encountered at that station wasn't just a random occurrence. It's part of a bigger picture. The radio waves, the people who disappeared, it's all connected." Olivia leaned in, curiosity piqued. "But what does this all mean? What exactly were they trying to do at the station?" Dmitri hesitated, his eyes darting around the room before lowering his voice. "The people working there were part of an experiment that was meant to manipulate the radio waves, to access a frequency that could bridge gaps. Gaps between dimensions, gaps between time, even between life and death. The station wasn't just a transmitter. It was a gateway. But the thing is, they weren't prepared for what it would lead to." Mark frowned. "A gateway? Are you saying there's something beyond our reality that these people were trying to open up?" Dmitri nodded solemnly. "Yes. The original engineers didn't understand what they were dealing with, and when they opened the door, things started slipping through. That's when people started disappearing. The radio signal you heard, it wasn't just a cry for help. It was a beacon. And that beacon is still active." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "So what exactly are we supposed to do about it? You said you knew about this place. Is there a way to stop it?" Dmitri's eyes darkened, and he leaned forward. "There's only one way to truly understand what happened there. There's a warehouse near the outskirts of Kiev. I'll take you there, but you need to be ready. What's inside is not what you expect. It's the heart of the operation. And once you see it, there's no turning back." The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had already seen the bizarre and the terrifying, but now it seemed like they were on the verge of uncovering something far more dangerous, something that could change their understanding of the world itself. "I'll show you where the warehouse is," Dmitri continued. "But remember, what you find in there may not just answer your questions. It may raise even more." Without another word, Dmitri stood and led them out of the cafe. The air felt heavier as they made their way through the city, and the usual bustle of Kiev seemed muted in the shadow of what they were about to face. The streets began to thin out as they left the city center behind, and soon they were driving through long, empty roads, surrounded by fields and trees. Eventually, Dmitri stopped in front of a dilapidated building, its windows boarded up and its outer walls covered in graffiti and overgrown vines. The warehouse looked unassuming from the outside, like so many others that had been abandoned long ago. "This is it," Dmitri said, voice barely above a whisper. "But be careful. Once we enter, we might not be alone." The tension in the air was palpable as the group followed him inside, the creaking of the rusted door echoing in the silence. As soon as they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was cold, musty, thick with the smell of old machinery and dust. Their flashlights illuminated rows of shelves, many of which were filled with abandoned equipment, old radios, boxes, and cables that had long since been forgotten. And then they saw it. At the far end of the warehouse was a large metal door, one that looked far newer than anything else in the building. Its surface was covered in strange symbols, almost as if it had been marked with a warning. There was no mistaking it. The door wasn't just part of the warehouse. It was a part of something much darker, much more significant. Dmitri stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the door's handle. "This is where it all began," he said. "What's behind this door is where the experiments went wrong, and it's where they're still trying to fix their mistakes." As Dmitri slowly turned the handle, the group exchanged nervous glances. The strange pull, the radio signal, and now this. Was this the culmination of everything they had experienced? And if they stepped through that door, would they finally uncover the truth? Or would they unleash something far worse? The door creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond. The end of part 1.